Hi, I'm delighted to be here with Jocelyn Chaplin. Now, you've got so many hats that you wear, lovely complementary hats. You're a psychotherapist, you're a counsellor, you're a wonderful painter. I've just seen the wonderful paintings. And you've written a number of books over the years. Tell me a little bit about, how do you describe yourself?
Oh. Well, sometimes I describe myself as a psychotherapist first, because that's my main work, working as a psychotherapist, which of course from the ancient Greek is psychotherapy, means healing of the soul.
Right.
So sometimes it's kind of the soul healer.
And that's so beautiful that you've even mentioned that soul healer, because one of the first questions I was going to ask you is that some people might think that psychotherapy on one side and then the spiritual work on the other side are very, very different. But your first few words about that soul healer mean that they're actually not separate at all, that they're at one with each other. Isn't that lovely to hear? And did the psychotherapy in that sense, did that work begin first?
Well, I think I've always been interested in the spiritual side of things. And most of the people that come to see me are on some sort of a spiritual path. Okay. It may be Buddhist, it might be pagan, it might be Christian, it might be Sufi, enormous range, but they're on that path. And so I see a large part of my work as combining the spiritual and the psychological.
Wonderful.
Because you find some people, they're very developed spiritually, you know, they've maybe been meditating a long time, they're sort of deep into the spiritual, but maybe they've neglected a bit of the emotional, psychological side of their life, and there might be a shadow side or something from their childhood, you know, that needs to be attended to. So I try to bring them together.
And so then there's a lovely sense of, really, in the true sense, that holistics, you actually have to help them in all aspects of their life, their spiritual life, their practical life, their personal life, their emotionally, how it is that they feel about themselves and so on. So how did this journey begin for you? Tell us a little bit briefly about your journey. When did that begin? When did you first become interested in spirituality and in the mind and in people and helping people? Where did it start?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, since I can hardly remember. I mean, as a little girl, I grew up in the bush in Africa, in southern Sudan, and I can remember, you know, listening to the drumming at night, and it just had something more magical, more powerful than the church I went to with my parents at the time. So I was always quite tuned into these other dimensions, and sometimes had experiences of great joy and love as I was growing up, just kind of melting in with everything around me, you know, the environment. And then I suppose later on I became quite interested in the feminine side of spirituality, feeling that, you know, Christianity and many other religions were very patriarchal, and that concerned me, and I rebelled a lot. You know, I rebelled against my own.
How old were you when that aspect where you wanted to?
Probably about 13.
Yeah.
I was a Sunday school teacher when I was 12, so I was very dedicated.
Yes.
But by the time I got to 13, 14, I was beginning to rebel, and I read Carl Jung, who of course is a wonderful therapist who explored the spiritual. And from that I became really interested in other kinds of spirituality other than where I was brought up. And gradually I went on holiday one year to Crete and discovered the ancient Minoan civilization, which you can see the snake goddess, who is also part of my, you know, website and so on, and just was completely bowled over by this extraordinary civilization 4,000 years ago and more, where most of the priests were women, priestesses were women, and it was very, very honouring of both nature and the flow of nature, and also honouring women. And then I researched a lot and began to write about it and teach it. And it went back, of course, thousands and thousands of years to many other civilizations. In fact, almost anywhere in the world, if you go back far enough, you find an honouring of Mother Earth, of the female ability to give birth.
So it's so interesting. This journey seems to have happened, that the interest in these things happened from childhood, and you were interested, and then you went on this particular kind of journey discovering this kind of civilization. Then you found yourself writing. So it's interesting because you're an author too. So when did you begin to professionally follow this kind of path. And I'd imagine, you know, for lots of people, if they're going down a path that one's wanting to be a healer, a therapist, or even a writer, they're often seen as, you know, a little bit way off beam. So tell us, when did you begin that journey to professionally, to decide professionally, actually, this is what I'm going to do and for a living?
Well, I did a degree in psychology.
Yeah.
When I was 17. Well, I went to university when I was 17. I think probably because I realised I was so neurotic, I wanted to understand myself, you know. So I did that and kind of worked in various community work, because I've also been very interested in politics with a small p, I hasten to add. Of course, this book's called Deep Equality. So at that time I was doing community work in West London mainly. And then I trained at a place called the Westminster Pastoral Foundation, which has a kind of spiritual side, as a counsellor professionally, and began to gradually build up my professional business. And I've always worked, as I say, in different in the different areas.
Yeah. And so I think that brings us beautifully onto I think, is this your latest book,
yes,
Deep Equality?
Yes, yeah.
Because I know when we've had a couple of brief chats, we've only met recently, you were talking about, and it says living in the flow of natural rhythms. And this flow, and what's lovely about just being here, sat with you, that we were talking about these different aspects, the writer, the healer, the therapist, the counselling. And what's interesting, I think, what's fascinating about your life is that these things which people often think are very different and roads have been very fluent and just flowing along nicely for you throughout. And so it's very interesting that this is a work that you do, bringing together for people who often find them, you know, very difficult aspects. Tell us a little bit about the book. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. Tell me a little bit about it.
Well, this developed out of an interest in the whole idea that equality, which is such a passion for so many people, has often been imposed from above. You know, the communists have had their problems, socialists have had their, you know, that very often...
and it's very apt now, isn't it? Where capitalism is having major problems.
Yes, exactly. So I've always been pretty anti-capitalist, and I've been a, you know, activist, protesting about all kinds of things over the years as well. But the whole concept of equality just feels like it's been sort of hijacked and made into only an external thing. I mean, I think people at the moment are actually beginning to come back to realising how important it is, because we've gone so far the other way.
Yeah, let me
so much inequality.
Well, you touched on something really interesting there. You said that we think about equality as an external thing. I get a sense from what you're saying that there's also a very inner aspect of equality. Can you tell us a little bit about that? It sounds fascinating. Tell me a little bit about what you mean.
Well, I mean, as I say, I've been involved in various you know, movements, protest movements, feminist movements, anti-racist movements and so on. And of course there's a lot one can do through the law, through politics, through economics. Of course, economic inequality at the moment is getting worse and worse. But of course, often you come up then against internal inequalities, internal hierarchies, where people may profess, oh yes, I believe in socialism, or I believe in feminism, but when you actually look inside, because remember that we're about 95% unconscious. We're only really conscious about 5%. So massive unconscious hierarchies and projections. And because I'm also a therapist, I'm very interested in, you know, what are the inner dimensions of equality. So
it suggests that what you're saying is that very often, whilst somebody might say, well, you know, this is my views on this and so on, actually that's not actually what actually manifests in their life, and that there are these... that there's not that flow. So tell us again, what does the book invite us to do? What does that explore? What does that explore?
Well, I think the idea that we inside ourselves are kind of limited, if you like. We're in prisons of hierarchies and rigidity and rigid.
And there's that link to those different labels that, okay, I'm a dad, I'm a mum, I'm a boss, I'm a this, I'm that, you know, I'm a manager, and now, but I'm also got to be but I'm also a carer, but I'm also part of the time I'm doing volunteering, all these different roles. Is it? Yeah.
Absolutely. So part of it is not getting too stuck in any role, so that we can fluidly flow in between the roles. We can also think in terms of the movement of the flow over time, so we're tuning in to what feels intuitively, and that's our deepest intuition. that we can follow that, to follow our path. So the book is partly about dissolving these inner hierarchies and inner rigidities and inner thought patterns and mindsets, you know.
So we can just be far more, it sounds so far more fluent in those different situations that we're naturally going to find ourselves in, and that we don't need to be uptight about those different things. There's just a natural rhythm, there's a natural meeting each scenario as we need to meet it.
Exactly. Oh, that's the key.
Yes.
So that you're appropriately reacting rather than from those inner. But I mean, it's so deep. This superior, inferior. You know, those inner kind of labels and things. So that it takes lifetimes to actually work on those and recognise that they're not being hard on ourselves, because we all do it all the time. I mean, goodness me, if I meet someone who's a celebrity, I'm going to be a little bit in awe, and I'm going to, you know, hold my breath, you know, and I'm trying to get away from that, so that, you know, we can look at everybody with equal respect, equal, you know, that ultimately as human beings
we're genuinely able to meet people from that equal space and hold that space equally and honour it. And wonderful. Well, tell us then a little bit about, and you touched it on a little bit there, tell us a little bit about the work, a typical day or a typical week for you. What are the kind of things that you'll be doing? We know you write, you paint and you work with people. Just give us a bit of a flavour of the work now, and I understand that there's some workshops and talks also that you're doing now. Tell us a little bit about the work.
Well, I'm doing a course. I quite often have groups that come here, which is this is the Serpent Institute, and they come here and I teach the ideas from the book. I teach practices, therapy practices, so we meditate, we use the breath a lot. So I do my own meditation every day, and I use the idea of the rhythm of the breath, because that is equalising. If we breathe out, we breathe in, and if we went on breathing out forever, we'd die very quickly. You know? So that's a very important part of my life, the idea of just in and out.
Yes,
and I teach people that, I do that with them. I also would teach some practices about dissolving the hierarchies, you know, exploring their personal development. And I might also sometimes, with some groups of people, I do rituals to honour the seasons, the equality, rhythmic changing of the seasons.
Because we can often forget that, isn't it? Particularly living, often if we live in a built-up or urban area or a city, we can sometimes forget that nature is our nature, we are of nature, and that we are part of the ecosystem, part of it.
Yes, absolutely. So, you know, when, for example, it's the winter solstice or the equinoxes, you know, when the days are shortest or longest, I often do little ceremonies, sometimes here, sometimes for other people in other places, honouring that. And I might do ceremonies for particular purposes, you know, to help people with, maybe they're getting married or something like that, you know, so that's also part of my work. And trying to share with as many people as possible these kind of ideas.
Wonderful. And before we close, I wanted to ask a little bit about, because you're somebody who's had the joy and the pleasure of watching lots of this stuff that we've been talking about unfold over the years. And I want to get a little bit of sense of what it is that you've seen change over the years. And you've been lucky, there's been all sorts of stuff that you've done. I know that you've written a best-selling and it's field book as well, and you've written a number of books. Tell me, what is it what's been your observation of the shift that you've seen over the time that you've seen in this work? Because your work is all about this thing about equality and where it is that we are. And I wonder if there are any general observations, because lots of people are saying that we're in a really interesting times now, and you touched on it earlier in terms of what's going on economically, what's going on politically, more people who are on a kind of spiritual journey, and with a big or a small. What are the shifts that you've seen? And
I mean, I could spend hours on that. But of course, I'm from the generation grew up in like the 50s and 60s, where we really had to fight for equality. So there was a lot of identity fighting for. I was a feminist. I fought for anti-racism, and I think there's been some massive changes in those areas, and to some extent in class. Although of course we've got massive inequality in terms of poverty, and so it's very exciting in some ways to see how far women have come. What a lot of changes for some black people. I'm talking worldwide actually, as well as in this country. but also that it hasn't gone nearly far enough for any of those inequalities, you know. So and sometimes there's been a backlash,
yes.
and I have noticed, particularly in terms of women and feminism, there's been a backlash. So I think that it's a bit like we take 2 steps forward and 1 step back in all this.
Yes.
And I think that some young people maybe don't realise all the fights that went on to have them in the place they are, and also that things are not, you know, they're not as good as they could be. But also it's very exciting at the moment, the whole Occupy movement and the Arab Spring, and the idea a lot of young people are saying, you know, enough is enough, that this degree of inequality is no longer acceptable, that capitalism as it is now is not sustainable. So I think there's a tremendous groundswell of young people, which I see very exciting. So it's kind of, it's a mixture, you know, to see the differences. And
what are your hopes as you look ahead, mindful again of that perspective and that lens that you bring? What are your hopes for what we might see? It's not really to predict the future, but what's your sense of what it is that you're hoping will bubble up, or are there patterns that you're seeing from when people are coming through the door and so on, and things that you think of how this flow may kind of unfold?
Well, I think hierarchies everywhere are dissolving. You've got the very, very big hierarchies of dictatorships dissolving. You've got a lot of the institutions, Parliament, the media dissolving, and I think people are gradually, I hope, less deferential, less concerned about hierarchies and status, and to some extent less concerned about making a lot of money, so that there'll be, I hope, much less in the way of admiration of the very greedy, you know, so that, and obviously more real democracy, not just voting as people did yesterday, but real democracy, participatory democracy, and that gradually the gap between rich and poor will get smaller all over the world, but also within countries, and that people will start treating each other as equals.
Well, that's lovely, and I think that's a lovely point to wrap up, and it's been beautiful just chatting to you, and I can get a lovely sense of that journey, and that lovely sense of all these different elements, isn't it? The political, the spiritual, the emotional, and so on, and just how it's been lovely just getting a sense of how they've bubbled and unfolded in your own life, and observing some of those things that are going on at the moment that seem very apt right now in this kind of flow. So tell us your website address, just if people are keen to track you down.
It's www.serpentinstitute.com.
Wonderful. Well, it's been such a pleasure to speak to you. I've got to go and turn off the camera myself, so I'm just going to let you sit and smile until I do that. We haven't got a camera person here, but it's been such a joy and a delight to chat to you. A real pleasure. Thank you, and all the best with the upcoming work, the talks, the workshops, and all of all the sessions. Thank you. A real pleasure.
Thank you.